What's going on, guys? ACP here. Got sort of a more kind of theoretical video for you guys here today. And I've talked about this with some other people before, but I want to sort of share my philosophy on how I classify decks in pretty much any card game. I'll be using a lot of GOAT format examples because I know that's like where most of my audience is coming from. But the intention here is for this to apply to like any trading card game at all. And I feel like Yu-Gi-Oh players kind of need this. Like Magic players, they've kind of been doing this shit for a while and kind of know like what all the terms mean. But I feel like Yu-Gi-Oh players just like kind of make up their classification system as they go along. So yeah, so want to shed some light here on that. So here's the problem, right? Obviously, like the whole point of language, human language is to be understood, right? So if two people are talking and one person thinks that a word means something different than what the other person thinks it means, then pretty quickly we get into problems. So the idea here is just to come up with that's really classification is just language. We're coming up with a language system that is easily understood and objective. So Magic, of course, is the oldest trading card game, and a lot of the terms that they used were kind of specific to their game. Because, when Magic first came out, it was the only trading card game. So they weren't, when they were classifying decks, they clearly weren't thinking about games that didn't even exist yet. So, then comes along Yu-Gi-Oh! And, they try to port over some of those terms, but they don't always, necessarily port over that well, because, the game is different. Games themselves can change, right? Obviously, Magic was a very different game, 20, 25 years ago than it is today. So they kind of added some terms that didn't really exist back then, which is fine. But for here, my goal is, without knowing anything about the game, what's the way that we can always classify decks that makes sense, right? And when I say makes sense, that's a big problem that Yu-Gi-Oh players have. In particular, the word control. For the longest period of time, really until, I don't know, 2006, 2007, Yu-Gi-Oh players just called every deck control. Oh, I'm playing Chaos Control. Oh, I'm playing Goat Control. Oh, I'm playing Burn Control. They would just call everything control. And if you call everything control, that defeats the purpose of the word, right? And sort of nowadays, I feel like the confusion stems to the words of mid-range and turbo. People call decks turbo that are winning on turn 20. That's not turbo, guys. That's not what that means. If I'm driving a Toyota Prius, that's not a turbo car, right? Turbo means fast. And same thing with mid-range. Mid-range, I feel like it applies very well to Magic due to the mana system, and it applies very well to other games that have a similar resource system. But in Yu-Gi-Oh, it's kind of a squishy word. So the first spectrum that I classify every deck on, in Magic, they call this beatdown versus control. I didn't necessarily like those words because it's not... I think beatdown is kind of easily understood, but control, I feel like it's a bit more of a squishy term. So I wanted something that was a bit more self-evident. I thought about proactive versus reactive because beatdown decks are generally proactive, whereas control decks are more reactive. But I settled on an even easier word, which is fast versus slow. And those terms, they just mean exactly what they mean, right? A deck that wins quickly is a fast deck. A deck that wins slowly is a slow deck. Pretty straightforward. And the nice thing here is that this is something that we can measure objectively, right? This isn't an opinion. It is an objective measurement. So we define a deck's slowness as the average turn that a deck wins its games. Pretty simple, right? So, a deck that has an average win on turn 20 is going to be a lot slower than a deck that wins on turn 2 on average, right? Pretty straightforward. and this again kind of goes along with beatdown versus control, right? You know, the aggro decks or the beatdown decks, they win very quickly. The control decks just kind of try to slow the game down, win very late. So similar concept. So here, here's an example, right? If you play a bunch of games of the deck, you go, okay, I played 5 games, I won on turn 6, lost on turn 4, won on turn 8, lost on turn 12, won on turn 7. Well, you just averaged 6, 7, and 8, which is 7. So that's the deck's average slowness, right? The slowness is 7, right? The higher the number is, the more slow the deck is. So yeah, pretty clear. Obviously, like in real life, you'd kind of want a bigger sample than just 5 games, right? Probably want like a sample of 20 or 30 games. Note the reason, note that you ignore the games that you lost, right? And the reason why is because when you lose a game, that says more about your opponent's ability to beat you than it does about your deck's ability to be slow or fast, right? So if I'm playing a control deck, right, and my opponent kills me on turn 3, well, that doesn't mean that I'm playing a fast deck. It means that they're playing a fast deck. So that's why we don't look at the games that we lost, right? Hopefully that makes logical sense. And so again, the whole point of creating these classification systems is for this all to be relative, right? It's relative to the meta, right? So if I say, oh, I'm playing some trading card game and I have a deck that wins on average on turn 7, that could be really slow or really fast, right? If we don't know anything about the game, that number is like kind of meaningless, right? So we can take this and come up with some sort of relative number, right? So if we take our deck slowness and try to estimate the average meta, on average, if we look at all the decks put together, how quickly they win, right? So if we look at the overall meta and say, if we take 2 random decks, have them play each other, on average, the game's going to end on turn 10. Okay, well then now that 7 is a lot more useful, right? So we can take our deck slowness, subtract the slowness of the meta, which is 10, and now our relative slowness is like a -3. So since 7 is less than 10, that means that our deck would be on the fast side of the spectrum in this particular meta. Pretty straightforward. So we're gonna need a second axis here, right? In most games, just classifying decks based on how slow or fast they are, it doesn't really work very well because there are all of these different kinds of different slow and fast decks, right? So if we're looking at the fast side of the spectrum, aggro decks and combo decks typically win very quickly, but are very different strategies, right? What they're trying to do, how you beat them, are just fundamentally different. And same thing with like kind of a classic control deck where you're just sort of, nickeling and diming your opponent on card advantage and then trying to win in the late game. That is going to be very different than like kind of a lockdown combo deck, right? Where you just stop your opponent from doing anything at all. And then, you have some win condition, that you play on turn 20 or whatever after you've totally locked your opponent down. Kind of different. So the problem is that if we only look at, fast versus slow, there's just too much overlap. We end up with too many decks that are fundamentally different being grouped together, which isn't the goal. We want similar decks grouped together. So that's why I added this second axis. And this axis is synergy to utility. And I think these words are pretty self-evident, but just in case they aren't, the idea is that, some decks are, kind of what Magic players call good stuff decks, right? Where you're just sort of playing all of the most powerful cards, the cards that are just sort of individually good, and that could be as part of a beatdown strategy, it could be as part of a control strategy. No relation necessarily there. Whereas some decks are sort of based around synergies that cards have together. So you're playing a lot of cards that are individually poor, but when used together, do something very powerful. That's the idea. And again, these are two fundamentally different things. The way you sort of beat a synergy deck versus the way that you try to beat a good stuff deck or a utility deck are very, very different. So, synergy to utility, it can also be measured pretty objectively. It's a little more squishy than the whole fast versus slow, but generally speaking, most players have a pretty good idea of what cards in their deck rely on other cards to be good versus cards that are standalone good. So, say we were playing, a Reasoning Gate deck in GOAT format, and our deck, of course, has 3 Monster Gates, and it also has Mirror Force, right? We can all agree, for the most part, that Monster Gate is a synergy card, whereas Mirror Force is a utility card. There's some cards that can be kind of either or, right? There's some where it's like, well, I'm playing it because it's a good card by itself, but I also have, some synergies that make it even better. So, there you can use some good judgment and say, okay, it's more like a half synergy, half utility kind of card. Again, like Scapegoat and GOAT format. You could come up with plenty of examples of these cards, depending on the game, the format, the meta, etc. So that's what you do there. Every card in your deck you classify as, okay, it's either totally a utility card, totally a synergy card, or like a half synergy, half utility card. And it can vary from deck to deck. It's not necessarily the case that a card in one deck, it's possible that a card could be a utility card in one deck but be a synergy card in another deck, right? Depending on how you're using it. So, once we sort of add up these synergy cards, we just divide that by the deck count, right? So if we have, I don't know, say we have 20 cards in our deck that are synergy cards, 10 cards are utility, and then 10 are half and half. Well, 10 divided by 2 is 5. You add 5 to 20, you get 25. And then if you're playing a 40 card deck, you do, 25 divided by 40, which is, I don't know what that is as a percentage, but you get the idea. And like the fast versus slow spectrum, synergy is also all relative, right? And this is true, like, particularly when you're looking back at different Yu-Gi-Oh formats. Like, if you're looking at like 2004, 2005, 2006 Yu-Gi-Oh, most decks were like mostly utility. Whereas now, like in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh, with all these like absurd, archetypes that Konami prints, decks are mostly synergy, right? So, if the overall synergy percentage in the meta is like 80%, and you're playing a deck that is like 60% synergy, well, relative to the meta, you're actually like kind of more of a utility deck, even though like you might not think about it that way internally. So if we sort of put these axes together, this is kind of how I would classify all of the different decks depending where they are on each axis. So in the bottom, we have, what I'd call classic control, classic beatdown, and mid-range. Up at the top, we have, fast combo in the fast synergy category. We have lockdown combo in the slow synergy part of the graph. And then kind of in the middle, we have like combo with interaction. So that's usually like deck that's kind of midway between the two. Not a super fast combo deck, and usually it plays like some sort of interaction, right? Like in Magic, maybe it's a combo deck that plays like counter spells or something like that. That would kind of be the idea. And then, we have decks that are kind of like beatdown, kind of like control, but they sort of play some more synergies. And usually the reason that they do that is to sort of be more powerful, right? It's kind of the trade-off of, higher variance, but, sort of a higher ceiling as well. So I couldn't think of like an amazing name for this. I just decided to call these decks high ceiling beatdown and high ceiling control, because that's really what they are, right? It's saying, well, instead of playing sort of a utility-based control deck, I'm going to add some really broken synergies, maybe some synergy that draws a lot of cards or something like that. And, what you get is you lean more into synergy, but now you're kind of more of a high ceiling control deck. And same thing with beatdown. So these are some GOAT format examples of all of these decks. So fast combo, pretty obvious here. Like your library, FTK, your empty jar, your Noel Gate. Those are decks, you're winning very quickly, right? You're kind of all about the combo. Combo with interaction, Reasoning Gate can fall into this depending on what cards you're playing. Like if you're playing Goats, Meta, Mirror, Torrential, Brain Control, that sort of thing, that's kind of a combo with interaction, right? You're definitely still a combo deck, but rather than being really fast like Noel Gate, you're saying, well, I'm going to sort of make sure that I can stop whatever my opponent is doing before I combo off. And Bazoo OTK kind of falls in that category too, I think, where you're trying to kill him with Dimension Fusion or Return, but you also have like a lot of interaction, ways to slow them down. that could be like Gravekeeper Spy, for example, could be Lightning Vortex, that type of thing. And then and then Lockdown combo, I think also pretty straightforward. You got your Drain, Burn, and your Pac-Man. Really, those two decks are in some ways very different, but in some ways very similar, right? All you're trying to do is just stop your opponent from doing anything at all. And, just win eventually because, well, at some point you have to, right? If you stop your opponent from doing anything, you'll find a way to kill him. And yeah, so, and just the win condition's different, right? Pac-Man is just attacking you with some tiny little monsters, and Drain Burn is gonna burn you out with, Just Desserts, Secret Barrel, that sort of thing. High ceiling beatdown, we got Gravekeepers and Gearfried Warriors. Gearfried Warriors is probably the better example, I think, because it's a lot like a normal warrior, but sort of the high ceiling part is you can just rip apart their hand in the early game with, Smoke Grenade, Trap Dust Shoot, Mind Crush, that sort of thing. Gravekeepers I would also put in this category just because, again, it's kind of a higher synergy beatdown deck, right? Cards like Necro Valley aren't very good by themselves. Gravekeepers Assail It, not very good by itself. Sometimes they play Skill Drain or Anti-Spell Fragrance, which can kind of also be leaning somewhat into synergy, or maybe they play Deck Devastation Virus, that's kind of also a synergy card. High ceiling controlled GOAT format, sort of the classic example of this is Thunder Dragon Chaos Turbo, and I use Turbo in quotes because Turbo is a terrible name for the deck that doesn't really make any sense. But yeah, Thunder Dragon Chaos, in a way, its strategy is very similar to something like GOAT Control or Flip Control, right? You're definitely trying to win by card advantage. It is a card advantage deck, and it is a slow deck, right? Thunder Dragon Chaos, it is not a deck where you're trying to win on like turn 3 or turn 5. You're trying to win on like turn 12. So it is definitely a slow deck, but it leans a lot more into synergy than something like GOAT Control does, right? That's what the Thunder Dragons are doing. That's what the Raigeki Breaks are doing. That's what the Card Destructions are doing. That's what the Night Assailants are doing, right? This is a slow synergy deck with a higher ceiling than something like GOAT Control. That's just fundamentally what the deck is. Classic beatdown, plenty examples of that in GOAT format. Really, anything with a bunch of warriors, that's a beatdown deck, right? You're trying to beat them down with monsters. You're trying to win the game quickly. It's a fast deck. Reinforcement of the Army is kind of like the definition of a utility card. In many ways. And same thing with like Zombies or Chaos Recruiter, the way that those decks are typically built, right? Chaos Recruiter, you're just summon a Mystic Tomato attack, summon a Shining Angel attack, summon an Azura Priest attack. Dust Tornado your back row, creature swap over my Mystic Tomato, run it over and get Donzlug, attack you again. So any deck that's doing a lot of attacking and is not really doing any defending, that is a fast deck, right? Relative to the meta. Mid-range doesn't pop up too much really in Yu-Gi-Oh! In general because, again, because of the lack of a mana system. But sometimes you do have some decks that sort of try to, they're not as fast as classic Beatdown, and they're not as slow as classic Control. And when you're sort of in that midpoint there, that's when you're kind of a mid-range deck, right? You'll often have some sources of card advantage, but you'll also often have some good ways to kill your opponent. And I will have an example of that kind of deck list coming up. Classic Control, I think that's kind of the one that a lot of people understand. Remember, Classic Control, it is a slow utility deck that is, it wins by card advantage, right? So Goat Control, Angel Chaos, Flip Control all fall into these categories, right? They are slow decks, they win the game very late. Sometimes Goat Control can get a really lucky draw and kind of win in sort of the early to mid stages of the game. But the way that these decks are generally played is about card advantage. It is about, stopping your opponent from killing you and then winning in the late game. So here's my my mid-range example. This is a goat control deck, because it's not really a control deck. That I built, I don't know, I think it was about 1 or 2 years ago. Did pretty well, although I don't think it's broken or anything. And we see here most of these cards kind of are utility cards, right? Most of these are cards that are individually good. So we're definitely kind of, leaning more into the utility on the synergy to utility part of the spectrum. But is this a beatdown deck or is this a control deck? The answer is it's not really either, right? You have a few cards here that are strictly defensive. Magician of Faith being the main one. You have some cards that are strictly offensive, like Azura Priest, like Abyss Soldier. And then you got some cards that are kind of in the middle. They can be offensive or defensive, right? Like Mystic Tomato and Spirit Reaper. So, if this deck were to play against a Goat Control mirror, usually you would try to be the beatdown player, right? You would try to sort of Dust Tornado their back rows, kill all their goats with the Azura Priest, use direct hits with Spirit Reaper to sort of put pressure on your opponent. But against, a more classic, fast aggro deck like Warriors, we would be trying to do the opposite, right? We would be trying to use Spirit Reapers and Mystic Tomatoes to defend our life points and try to take over the game with cards like Creature Swap and Metamorphosis. So this is kind of like what a mid-range deck looks like. So I also made some kind of modern-ish Yu-Gi-Oh! Examples. I have dabbled a little within the past few years. So, example of fast combo would be really just any FTK deck. I feel like modern Yu-Gi-Oh's always got one of those, whether it's some Firewall Dragon shenanigans or some sort of danger shenanigans. If you're playing a deck where you're basically trying to win every game on turn 1 or turn 2, that is a fast combo deck. And, when Solomon Great first came out, I was playing a bit of that, and that would be what I'd consider a combo with interaction deck. Definitely in many ways a combo deck, but at the same time you kind of had some actual traps that you could search out to be your interaction, and then some hand traps as well that would be your interaction. So, definitely a combo deck. Pretty much every card in the deck was, some sort of synergy card. So we're definitely on the synergy side of the spectrum. But, this wasn't some, like, super fast FTK deck, right? We're kind of slower than those. And then, Lockdown Combo, easy example, Mystic Mine, right? Definitely a combo deck. It's kind of a one-card combo deck, right? Where you're just, Mystic Mine, GG. But, it is a lockdown combo deck, right? The deck is all about synergies, right? It is, Mystic Mine or bust. But it is also a slow deck, right? This is not a combo deck where, you're dead on turn 2, right? This is like hey, I'll Mystic Mine, stop you from doing anything for the rest of the game, and then kill you eventually, right? And then for high ceiling beatdown, I would... So, some of these categories get a little squishy, but, high ceiling beatdown I would kind of classify as Subterror. It was definitely a deck where... you were trying to beat down your opponent, right? You were trying to attack with monsters, right? This wasn't a deck where you're like, I'm gonna summon 5 monsters on turn 1 and kill you, right? It wasn't that kind of a deck. As a beatdown deck, it was, typically slower than your combo decks, of course, but you were basically using these Subterror synergies to beat down your opponent, right? And then for high ceiling control, easy example there, Sky Strikers, right? Definitely a card advantage based deck, but it is a card advantage based deck that thrives on the utility of all the Sky Striker cards, right? You are not playing very many utility cards, right? You're playing synergy cards. You're playing synergy cards there. So yeah, Sky Strikers, pretty slow deck most of the time, but it was a kind of a slow deck that leaned into synergy more than a classic control deck would. So that's why it's a high ceiling control deck. And for classic beatdown, you don't really have too many of these decks anymore in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, but you kind of had them. You kind of have them a little on and off, and that's really just sort of like an anti-meta or stun deck, right? If your game plan is I'm gonna summon Inspector Border and attack you 4 times until you're dead, that's kind of a classic beatdown deck, right? You're not playing Inspector Border or Fossil Dyna or Barrier Statues because they have some great synergy with the rest of my deck. No, you're playing them because they have a lot of utility against the expected meta. So, classic beatdown is just sort of, your good stun monsters plus your good traps, and then you just beat them down, right? And then, for modern Yu-Gi-Oh, I don't think we really have too many examples of mid-range and classic control anymore. The problem is that, like, there aren't just, like, individually, like, powerful card advantage cards, right? I mean, you have, like, Pot of Desires, which is kind of, like, a +1 that any deck can play. But, it's like that's about it. So, classic control really doesn't exist anymore in Yu-Gi-Oh! In the way that it used to, and kind of the same thing for mid-range, right? I mean, really the only, like, heavy, utility-based deck that we can really use anymore would be like an anti-meta / stun kind of thing. There aren't really, like I said, there aren't really just a ton of like, I can play all these different things that gain card advantage and, use them all together in ways that don't really have heavy synergy. Like, that's just not really a thing anymore. Like, the meta's just kind of evolved past that. Konami isn't printing those cards anymore. So briefly, I'll sort of go over the strengths of all these different categories. Some are more obvious than others. Fast combo, pretty obvious, right? If you're always trying to win on turn 1, even if your opponent, like, sides in some sort of hard counters, you give them very little time to draw it. That's why, like, in GOAT format, I often say, like, Library FTK is often more difficult to counter than some of these other combo decks because they give you the least amount of time to draw your counters. And then, if you sort of lean sort of towards the slower part of the spectrum and go, okay, what if I play combo with interaction? Sort of the advantages of that is that it's a little more lower variance. It's not like as all or nothing. It's kind of, hey, I'm gonna pay attention to what my opponent's doing to some extent, right? Whereas fast combo just tries to ignore all that. Lockdown combo, in many ways, it can be similar to fast combo in that you sort of take control of the game very early, as early as turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. But typically these lockdown decks are a bit easier to execute, right? I mean, the game plan is a lot more straightforward. Oh, I'll just stop them from doing anything, draw past 10 turns in a row, then play some kill condition, right? Very easy game plan. And then the advantages of high ceiling beatdown is it's kind of a lot like classic beatdown, but you sort of have better nut draws typically, right? And sort of the same thing with like high ceiling control, right? If you're playing like high ceiling control versus like a classic control deck, typically the high ceiling control deck is going to have the advantage, at least in game one, because it's like, hey, we're both doing the same thing, but my deck has really broken synergies and yours doesn't. So that's kind of the incentive there. And classic beatdown, advantage is pretty obvious, fast, low variance, easy to execute, summon dudes, attack with them. Pretty straightforward. Mid-range, especially in Magic, I feel like mid-range decks are often more difficult to counter, right? Because aggro decks, it's like, oh, I need to kill their guys. Control decks, oh, I need to, either kill them quickly or turn off their card advantage engine or something. Mid-range, it's kind of, well, they sort of do everything, so you can't really, like, counter them that hard. Classic control, pretty low variant strategy. Basically, the idea with classic control is you're just playing all the good card advantage stuff, right? All the good removal, all the good card advantage, whatever. And then, against like a beatdown deck, it's just, hey, if I get to late game, I'm pretty guaranteed to win. And then weaknesses. Weaknesses are pretty important. So I say fast combo, a lot of times, you just lose to hard counters, right? Like if you're playing, I don't know, Belcher and Magic or something. Oh, they played Mindbreak Trap. Oh, I just lose now, Combo with interaction, I find that the downsides to that is that usually the interaction that you're playing isn't applicable to the entire meta, right? So like if I'm playing a Reasoning Gate deck with Brain Control isn't going to be good against every deck. If I'm playing a Magic, some sort of combo deck in Magic with, maybe like Lightning Bolt as interaction, right? Yeah, I'm thinking like maybe some Pyromancer Ascension deck. You're playing Lightning Bolt as kind of like a combo piece and interaction. It might not be applicable to the entire meta. Some decks might be able to just kind of ignore it. And the lockdown combo, the main downside is that like oftentimes you literally have to beat every single card in your opponent's deck, right? So unlike fast combo where it's like, hey, you can side in outs, but you better draw them turn one. Lockdown combo is like kind of the opposite. It's like, hey, if you side in some hard counter, I'm going to give you all the time in the world to draw it. And then, high ceiling beatdown, those decks can typically be kind of fragile. Like someone was asking me about Gearfried Warriors in chat the other day, and I was kind of like, well, it's kind of a glass cannon. If you don't draw your right combo pieces, you may still be able to beat them down, but oftentimes you'll just sort of draw some things that don't really go well together, right? You draw like the wrong half of your combos, and then all of a sudden it becomes kind of hard to actually kill your opponent potentially. So yeah, high ceiling control. The main downside is that it's kind of more vulnerable to the side deck. In general, this is just true in general. The more you lean towards synergy versus utility, the more vulnerable you are to being hard countered, to your opponent bringing something in the side deck that kind of wrecks your deck. And we sort of see that when we're looking at something like Thunder Dragon Chaos versus Goat Control in Goat format, right? There's not a ton of like amazing cards to side against Goat Control, but there are lots of good cards you can side against Thunder Dragon Chaos. So that's kind of like the downside there. And then classic beatdown, some sort of high ceiling beatdown deck may be able to sort of like pseudo combo your opponent to get around their defensive options. Classic beatdown, typically not so much. You're just kind of playing guys, hoping that, there's no such thing as wrong threats, only wrong answers. So you just kind of hope that your opponent has the wrong answers. But if they have the right answers, then, you may be in trouble. And, from my experience of playing mid-range decks, both in Yu-Gi-Oh! And in Magic, these decks are kind of, jack of all trades, master of none. Typically, mid-range decks are not going to be like super, super broken, right? It's kind of like, oh, I'm sort of average against everything. And yeah, and it's often kind of difficult to beat the entire meta, right? To beat the combo decks, the beatdown decks, the control decks. You know, you typically have to sort of like lean one way or the other. So lastly, the reason why I like this system is because, again, easy to understand and use. Like, I can, if someone shows me a deck in any card game, I can quickly categorize it. Oh, okay, you know, this is this kind of deck. And it is objective rather than subjective. The fact that like people are arguing over whether, oh, is this aggro, is this control, is this mid range, is this combo? This is to avoid all those arguments, right? It's just, hey, you know, plot the dot. Here we are, you know, end a discussion. And again, I also like it. You know, I've played a lot of different card games. I've played Magic, I've played Pokemon, I've played Yu-Gi-Oh, I've played Hex TCG, I've played Hearthstone. So I've played a lot of different games. And to me, this system works for any game, any format, any meta, right? We can always use this. So if you're kind of a multi-TCG master, I think you'll like the system. And yeah, I kind of already said this, but again, it helps me sort of compartmentalize these decks, right? So if I'm thinking, you know, if I was even coming back to Yu-Gi-Oh tomorrow, I would use this system, right? Someone showed me some deck and said, hey, I think you should play this deck, it's good. I would try to understand, okay, is this faster than the average deck? Does it lean more into synergies than the average deck does? And that sort of allows me to like evaluate the deck's strengths and weaknesses and think, okay, you know, what's sort of like the worst thing that can go wrong if, you know, what can go wrong if I play this kind of deck? So, you know, that's also why I like this system. And yeah, it also helps me counter other strategies. So yeah, I mean, I use this in GOAT format a lot, you know, especially since the meta shifts around a lot. You know, I think to myself, okay, you know, what decks am I trying to counter? What kind of decks are these? And then, like, what are the weaknesses? How do I counter that, right? So if, you know, if everyone's playing a lot of combo decks, you know, a lot of fast combo decks, I know, okay, I need some hard counters. I need hard counters that just totally screw them on, like, turn one. You know, if I'm playing against, like, a lot of beatdown decks, you know, like Warriors, you know, like, for a very long time I was saying, oh, you need to, like, side in Gravekeeper Spy, right? Obviously now they kind of have been able to, like, get past that a bit. But, you know, 2-3 years ago, you know, I saw people siding in like 7 Tools of the Bandit against aggro. And I'm like, no, you need Gravekeeper Spy. You need Messenger Appease, right? Because that is how you beat those decks. You beat them by slowing them down. They are a fast deck. If they are a faster deck than your deck, you need to slow them down, right? So yeah, so I feel like part of the reason that my side decks have been so good, particularly in GOAT format, is because like I understand these fundamentals. So yeah, hope you guys like this video. Let me know what your thoughts are. Take care.